In this video, I'm going to explain the basics of using Blender for sculpting, and then you'll see a demonstration of how to make this sculpture. The look that I was going for was that of someone who was enjoying listening to some music. This is not intended to be a true-to-life sculpture because I exaggerated some of the features, and it doesn't contain really fine detail like small creases in the lips, but it's a fun character to sculpt. For this video, I'll be using Blender version 2.90.1. Before we begin, I want to mention that I recommend using a graphics tablet for sculpting. You can use a mouse for sculpting, but I personally believe that a graphics tablet is better for this purpose. I'm more precise when using a graphics tablet as opposed to a mouse. In addition to that, the strength of the brushes can be controlled by how hard I press down with the graphics pen. So for example, if I'm using a mouse with the crease brush and the strength is set to 0.3, it looks like this. If the strength is set to 1, it looks like this. If I switch to the graphics tablet, I can change the strength by simply changing the pressure on the pen. In addition to that, I bought a graphics tablet that has a dial on it, and I set it up so that the dial changes the size of the brush. In Blender, the shortcut keys for changing the brush size are the left and right square brackets. So I set up the dial to generate square bracket key presses, and now I can use it to change the brush size. The graphics tablet that I bought is the XP Pen Deco Pro small size tablet. If you follow the link that I placed in the video description, then you can see the current price and learn more about this graphics tablet. But I need to make the disclosure that as an Amazon associate, I earn from qualifying purchases. I'll show you how to use a mouse when I'm explaining the basics of using Blender for sculpting, but a graphics tablet will be used when sculpting this head. When you're using a mouse, you can change the strength of the brush here, or you can press Shift F and drag the mouse. You can change the size of the brush here, or you can press F and drag the mouse. In addition to changing the brush size and strength here, you can also press N to open the sidebar and switch to the Tool tab. You can also set the size and strength here. I'll close the sidebar. You can also switch to the Active Tool tab and change the brush size and strength here. To start a new sculpting project, go to the File menu and select New and then Sculpting. The various brushes are here on the left. I like to expand the brush panel so that I can see more brushes without scrolling. If you expand it even further, then the names of the brushes are displayed, but I prefer this view. Up here, you can mirror the sculpture on the x-axis. This is helpful for sculpting things like faces since you only need to sculpt one side. You can also mirror on the y and z axes or none at all. If you're using a mouse, then press the left mouse button to use the brush. If you hold down the Control key while doing this, then the brush will work differently. For many brushes, holding the Control key will cause the brush to invert and work in reverse. For example, the Draw brush raises the surface, but if I hold down the Control key, then this brush depresses the surface. There are some brushes that can't work in reverse, like the Grab brush. For this brush, if you hold the Control key, then it will pull straight out or straight in. If you hold down the Shift key while using a brush, then it will typically act like the Smooth brush, which smooths the mesh. So to recap, press F to change the brush size, press Shift F to change the strength. Holding the Control key causes many of the brushes to work in reverse, and holding the Shift key typically makes the brush act like a smooth brush. Now let's talk about the mesh. One of the keys to helping with your sculpting results in Blender is to understand the mesh and the ways that its resolution is affected. It's common practice to start a sculpture at low resolution to create larger overall shapes, then increase the resolution as more detail is needed. Let's switch to wireframe view so that we can see the resolution of the mesh better. In Blender, there is more than one way to control the resolution of the mesh. One way is from the Remesh menu. If you switch to the Active Tool tab, you can find the Remesh menu here. Also, you can set the voxel size and then click the Remesh button to update it. The smaller the voxel size, the higher the resolution. So if I make the voxel size smaller and click the Remesh button, you can see that our mesh now has higher resolution. I'll switch back to the default resolution of 0.035 so that we can see the mesh better. If I zoom in, you can see that when we remesh it, the mesh is made up of quads. Now let's look at what happens to the mesh when we start using brushes. If we use the snake hook brush and pull the mesh out, you'll see that the mesh stretches and the resolution in the new area is very low. But if we click the remesh button, a new mesh is generated and it's no longer stretched. Another way to control the resolution of the mesh is to use dynamic topology. You can enable it by adding a check mark next to Dyne Topo. You can also enable it up here. Dynamic topology will add or remove geometry as you use the brushes. This allows you to change the resolution only in the areas that you need to. Let's look at an example. We'll keep the detailing value set to relative detail for now, but we'll change the detail size to 5. The smaller the value, the higher the detail. Now when we use the snake hook brush, it adds geometry to the mesh instead of stretching it. Another thing that happens when you use dynamic topology is that it converts the entire mesh into triangles. But the number of vertices, or the resolution, is only changed where the brush is used. So if I use the draw brush, you can see that the resolution changes where the brush is used, but nowhere else. By default, the detailing value is set to relative detail. With this setting, the resolution will be a combination of the detail size and how far you're zoomed in. I'll switch to solid view so that we can see this better. With the draw brush still selected, let's zoom out, change the brush size, and draw a line. You can see that the resolution is pretty low. But now, while we're zoomed in, if we use the brush, the resolution is higher. The default value for detailing is relative detail, but I prefer to use constant detail. With constant detail, the resolution will be whatever you set here, regardless of how far you've zoomed in. And when using constant detail, this value is called resolution instead of detail size, and the larger this value is, the higher the resolution will be. A really nice thing about using constant detail is that we now have this selection tool that we can use to set the resolution. If we click it, we can now go to the mesh, and the resolution will be set to match the resolution of the mesh at the spot over here where we click. So now if we use the snake hook brush, the resolution of the new geometry will match the resolution of the mesh at the spot where we sampled it. An important thing to know about dynamic topology is that not all brushes work with it. For example, as we've seen, the snake hook brush supports it. But the grab brush does not. An easy way to determine whether or not a brush supports dynamic topology is to increase the resolution and then try the brush while in wireframe view. So let's select the draw brush. Now when we use it, the area becomes darker, which means that more geometry was created. So this brush supports dynamic topology. If we select the smooth brush, you can see that this brush does not support it. So whenever you hold the Shift key while using a brush to make it act like a smooth brush, dynamic topology is not used and no new geometry is created. Another way to control the resolution in Blender is to use the multi-resolution modifier, but I'm not going to cover that method in this video. Now let's take a quick look at some of the brushes. In this video, I'll be covering the brushes that are used to sculpt this head, as well as a couple of others too. The first brush that we'll look at is the draw brush. As we saw earlier, this brush raises the surface, but you'll notice that it only raises it so far, and continuing to use it doesn't make much difference. It seems to hit a limit. But if I stop using it and then start using it again, it will raise the surface until it hits the limit again. This behavior can be changed in the brush settings. If you enable Accumulate, then this brush will continue to raise the surface for as long as you use it. For most of the brushes that have this option, Accumulate is disabled by default. I typically use the defaults for this value. If we use this brush over the lips, you'll notice that it doesn't quickly cover up the detail that is already there. But let's look at the clay brush. This brush does quickly cover the existing detail. So if this were real clay that we were sculpting, what it seems like to me is that the draw brush moves the clay and the clay brush adds new clay. The clay strips brush also adds new clay, and with this brush, accumulate is enabled by default, so clay will continue to be added for as long as you use it. This brush, because of its square shape, can make it easier to add certain details. The layer brush adds a layer of clay with a specific thickness. Each time you use it, another layer is added. The inflate brush pretty much does what the name implies. It inflates it. The blob brush can make nice sphere-like shapes. Holding the Control key while using this brush lets you make sphere-like depressions. The crease brush is a very useful brush. We could use it, for example, to add definition around the nose, or to sharpen the crease between the lips. Holding the Control key while using this brush sharpens things in an outward direction. So we could use it to sharpen the top edge of this lip. The Smooth brush makes the mesh smoother. This is the same brush that you get when you hold down the Shift key while using the other brushes. And keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, that this brush does not add new geometry when using dynamic topology. The Flatten brush can flatten a surface. With the Fill brush, you'll notice that when we start using it over the lips, that the center of the lips start to fill in without affecting the top and bottom of the lips. The Scrape brush does the opposite. It starts by scraping off the top and bottom of the lips without affecting the center of the lips. But if you scrape enough, it will reach the center. The Grab brush moves the mesh that is inside the brush. The Elastic Deform brush is similar, except that it will also move parts of the mesh that are outside the edges of the brush. We saw the Snake Hook brush earlier. The last brush that we're going to look at is the Mask brush. The mask icon may look like this in other versions of Blender. When you mask a portion of your mesh, then the other brushes will have no effect on the masked area. Now when we use the Draw brush over the mask area is not affected. We can also invert the mask from the Mask drop-down menu. The shortcut for it is Control-I. Now we can work on an isolated area. To clear the mask, go to the Mask menu and select Clear Mask or use Alt-M. I previously recorded the creation of this head sculpture, and now I'll play it as I describe to you what I was doing. I'll be speeding up the video in a lot of places to prevent it from becoming too long. I don't actually sculpt as quickly as it looks. Also, I want to mention that I used a graphics tablet for this sculpture. I started by creating a new sculpting project, and then expanded the brush panel so that I wouldn't need to scroll it. The first thing that I'm going to do is make a basic head shape. I'll do this by pressing 1 on the number pad for front view, and then select the Elastic Deform brush. I want the brush to affect the whole head, and so I'm going to make the brush size very large. Then I'll squeeze it in. Next, I'm going to pull down the chin, so I'll make the brush smaller. Now I'll press 3 on the number pad for right side view so that I can pull the chin toward the front. The neck is the next thing that I'm going to work on, and so I'll press Control along with 7 on the number pad for bottom view. Then I'll select the Mask brush and mask an area the size of the neck. Now I can rotate the view to look at it from the side. Since the mask area is where the brushes will have no effect, I need to invert the mask. Now I can use the grab brush with a large brush size to pull down the neck. At this point, I no longer need the mask. When I pulled down the neck, it stretched the mesh, and so I'm going to update it. At the same time, I'll also increase the resolution by changing the voxel size. Now when I press the Remesh button, the mesh is no longer stretched and the mesh has a higher resolution. Now I'll hold down the Shift key so that the brush will become the smooth brush and I'll smooth out the neck. Next, I'm going to set the position of the eyes. So I'll press 1 on the number pad for front view, and then I'll select the draw brush. I'm going to locate the eyes at the center of the head. The way that I'll do this is by using the brush as a measurement tool. So I'll increase the brush size until it's close to the top of the head and the bottom of the chin. The center of the brush is now where I want the eyes to be. Now I'll decrease the brush size and sculpt in the area for the eyes. Next, I'll select the scrape brush and start giving the face some shape. I'll start with a small brush under the eyes, then a larger brush for the cheek, and then a larger brush for the side of the face. I'll also use the scrape brush on the side of the head. Then I'll smooth things out a little. Now I'm going to enable dynamic topology, and I'll set it to constant detail. I'll use the selection tool to set the resolution to match the rest of the mesh. Next, I'll work on the nose. I'll start with the draw brush for the basic structure. Then I'll switch to the clay strips brush to refine the shape while I periodically smooth it. When I rotate the view to the side, it looks like the nose should extrude further, and so I'll use the grab brush to pull it out. Then I'll continue with the clay strips brush. There's still more work that I'll do on the nose later, but for now I'm going to move on to the mouth. I'll use the draw brush to add some basic structure for the lips and mouth. Then I'll switch to the crease brush to divide the top lip from the bottom. The size of the brush here is important. The larger the brush is, the thicker the lips will look. I'm going to give him a big smile. To sharpen the top and bottom of the lips, I'll hold down the Control key while using the crease brush. Then I'll release the Control key and strengthen the crease between the lips. When I rotate the view to the side, it seems like the area under the nose should be fuller, and so I'll use the inflate brush here. I'll also use this brush for the areas under the bottom lip. To sculpt the indentation in the upper lip, I'll use the clay strips brush along with some smoothing. Then I'll go back to the crease brush while holding the Control key to give the lips some more definition. When viewed from the side, I'm not happy with the shape of the mouth, and so I'll smooth it out and resculpt it with the crease brush. From the front view, I want the mouth to be wider, and so I'll use the grab brush with a large brush size to widen it. I'll also pull up on the top lip a little. Then I'll do a little smoothing. Next, I'm going to work on the ear. For this, I'm going to use the mask brush and draw a basic ear shape. Then I'll invert the mask so that the brush will only affect the ear. Now I'm going to use the snake hook brush to pull the ear out. If you recall, this brush works with dynamic topology, and so it will add geometry to the mesh. To get the results that I want, I'm going to make the brush much larger than the ear, and I'll also hold down the Control key so that it will pull straight out. When I've pulled it out far enough, I'll then pull the brush down slightly to give it this shape. Now I can clear the mask. Now I'll use the grab brush with a large brush size to make changes to the position and shape of the ear. I'll finish the ear later. I just wanted something here now so that I would know where to position the jawline. So now I'll work on the chin and the jaw. I'm going to give him a large chin, and I'll do a lot of it using the draw brush. You'll notice that I'm rotating the view frequently. Sometimes things will look great from one angle but bad from another. Rotating frequently can help you catch problems early. Now I'll draw in the jawline. Next, I'll switch to the grab brush and push things around to get the shape that I want. Here I'll use the clay strips brush to add some definition to the chin and then smooth things out. Then I'll go back to the grab brush. The bone structure around the eyes should not be straight, and so I'll raise it. For the closed eyes, I want a sphere shape, and the blob brush will work well for this. Now I'll use the crease brush for where the eyelids come together. Next, I'll use the draw brush to start adding bone structure to the face. Here I want to give the mouth a bigger smile, and so I'm going to use the grab brush to pull the corner of the mouth up. You'll notice that when I do this, a fold starts to form at the corner of the mouth. So I'll switch to the inflate brush to give it more definition. I'll continue using the inflate brush to fill in the cheeks and bone structure. Then I'll move things around a little using the grab brush, and then continue with the inflate brush. I'm also smoothing occasionally. Now I'll use the crease brush to define some areas, and then go back to the inflate brush. Heads are not shaped this perfectly, and so I'm going to work on the shape. Using the inflate brush, I'll inflate the forehead until it's too large. Then I'll use the scrape brush on the center of the forehead, the side of the forehead, and the top of the head, and then I'll smooth it out. This is the shape I ended up with. Now I'm going to use the inflate brush while holding the Control key to depress some areas around the temple and side of the head. I'll also smooth out this area. Next, I'll use the blob brush while holding the Control key to make the nostrils. Then I'll continue refining the nose using the grab brush and the crease brush. Later in the video, I'll return to the nose to make some final changes. Now we'll work on the ear, which can be fairly time-consuming. I spent more time on the ear than any other part of this sculpture. I'll start by smoothing off the top corner of the ear. I want this part of the ear to be relatively flat. Next, I'll use the blob brush to fill in the ear, smoothing occasionally. Now I'll use the draw brush to form the outside edge of the ear. Then I'll press the Control key to invert the brush and form the inside edge of the ear. Next, I'll switch to the clay strips brush and draw in some parts of the ear. I'm not trying to add structure here. I'm going to use the draw brush for that. I'm just marking the areas where I plan to use the draw brush. Now I'll use the draw brush to give the inside of the ear some shape. While I do this, I'm also holding the Control key at times to invert the brush as well as smoothing from time to time. I'm continuing to use the inverted draw brush to shape the back of the ear. I first outline with a small brush size, and then I increase the brush size for the larger areas. I'm also smoothing frequently. Now I'll use the grab brush to make some changes to the overall shape of the ear. I'll then use the draw brush again, followed by the inflate brush. I'm using the inflate brush in areas where I want small changes. I'm also using the inflate brush with the Control key to invert it. I'll switch to the inverted draw brush and then the grab brush and also do a little more smoothing. Then I'll use the inflate brush to finish up the ear. Next, I'll continue using the inflate brush to even out the jaw. Now I'll switch to the grab brush to make the part of the body that the neck attaches to. I'll then use the crease brush to define where the neck attaches to the body. Now using the draw brush, I'll add some neck muscles and an Adam's apple. Next, I'll use the elastic deform brush to make the skin fold next to the nose rounder. The nose needs some improvement, and so I'll switch to the grab brush and start making some changes to the shape. I'm using a fairly small brush size, and I'm making a bunch of small changes. To finish things up, I'm going to smooth a couple of areas. The sculpture is done now, and that concludes this video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and leave a comment.